with your help, I'd like to welcome to the lectern Robert G. Kaplan for this lecture. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here in this August, historic, overwhelming setting, truly, where you can really feel history. I spent the day yesterday in Ypres and Passchendaele, and was very moved at how, in a fit of imperial exuberance and a loss of tragic thinking, Europe got involved in a war that it thought would last weeks only and lasted for 4 years and killed upwards of 20 million people. So I'm going to talk tonight about the world and Europe's place in it, in a sense of thinking tragically in order to avoid tragedy. In other words, constructive pessimism, not to shy away, not to avoid the tough issues, the tough realities that we face. So think of it as an exercise of critical thinking in line with the spirit of this lecture series. Now, Vladimir Lenin, who is one of the most awful characters in history, happened to have a very, very interesting phrase, which became somewhat of a cliche. He said that decades could go on and nothing happens. Then weeks and months go on and decades happen. And I think we're at that point right now, where the next few weeks and months in Ukraine could determine a lot of things, could determine the future of Russia, could determine the future of Europe, could, affect relations between the US and China, and many other things. So in that spirit, let me prepare the background to where we got to where we are. At the end of the Cold War, everyone was in a fit of exuberance. People thought that because Poland became democratic, suddenly sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East would become democratic. There was this sense that Europe, that because the eastern half of Europe suddenly became free, this had meaning for the whole world. And it turned out that it didn't. It didn't at all. The rest of the world went on in a very different way, oblivious to what had happened in Europe. And then even within Europe, you had the wars of the Yugoslav succession in the former Yugoslavia. And also in the 1990s, everyone, especially at Davos, was babbling on about globalization. How globalization would bring peace to the whole world, that globalization was an actual security structure that would enforce peace. In fact, what happened was this. Globalization, I call the 1990s Globalization 1.0. And Globalization 1.0 was generally a good news story. It was about the spread of freedom throughout Europe, if not in other parts of the world. It was about the weakening and, in some cases, the elimination of mass poverty in other parts of the world. It was about the creation of new middle classes in many parts of the world. And it was about what was then considered the liberating aspects of technology. Because remember, when the Berlin Wall fell, nobody had a smartphone. Nobody had an email address, practically. It was a world before digital technology when the Berlin Wall fell. And all this came in the context of an American dominating power that enabled technological sharing across countries and the spread of democracy. So Globalization 1.0 was a good news story. And we thought that was the end of the story, that was it. But then we had, little by little, Globalization 2.0. And Globalization 2.0 was not such a good story. It was about the rise of populism, the fear of middle classes, the use of technology for negative things, the return of autocracy, the intractability of many forms of poverty, and most importantly, it was about the beginning of great power fractures throughout the world, especially between Russia and the United States, between China and the United States, and even tension at the time between Russia and China. That was globalization 2.0. And the real, historians love dividing chapter breaks. They love chapter breaks. And a neat chapter break between the two forms of globalization was COVID-19. In a sense, when COVID-19, it kind of edged us from one form of globalization to another. And now, of course, we're heading into globalization 3.0, which is about artificial intelligence and other things, which could be used for many good things, such as scientific and medical research, and also for many negative things. Already, U.S. Arleigh Burke destroyers have automated weapon systems called the Aegis weapon system. And a typical U.S. guided missile destroyer can destroy a small city. And the U.S. has about 80 of them. And so does China, and so do other countries. Imagine all those weapon systems communicating with each other through artificial intelligence, and you get the sense of what warfare could be like in the future. That warfare, that warfare will not be like the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944 at the end of World War II, where ships go at it. It will be systems, intelligent systems fighting with each other, trying to disable the satellites in space of others. So that's where we're going in globalization 3.0. Now, the world today, I think you'll agree, and this is the real theme of my lecture, seems to be more claustrophobic, more anxious, more nervous, more in a state of there's always a permanent crisis somewhere. Why is that? What are the mechanics behind that? Well, the mechanics are that we're going from 7.5 billion people on Earth to maybe 10 billion people on Earth. And this is even with reduced population growth rates, remember. More and more of us are living in cities, in crowded cities. More and more cities of the developing world will be badly urbanized with slums and shanty towns. We will all be more and more connected with each other. There's a sense of connectedness that is going on. And because of the ability of technology, cyber, digital, jet airplanes, to bring closer far ends of the earth, we're in a situation where a crisis in one part of the earth can dramatically intersect and interact with another part of the earth as never before in history. Now, interconnectivity is a good thing in terms of financial markets, but it can be a very negative, destabilizing thing in terms of geopolitics. People say America should focus only on Asia and not on Ukraine. I hear this a lot in Washington. They miss the point. The world is increasingly fused and claustrophobic, and the way things turn out in Ukraine could have a dramatic effect on Chinese thinking going forward over the next 10 or 20 years. So we can't kind of separate out regions to the extent that we had to. There was a great American-Hungarian intellectual of the mid-20th century named John von Neumann. He worked on the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb. He could also recite Shakespeare's plays from heart, large portions of them. He was a true intellectual. He was a mathematician, a musical composer, everything, a true genius. And he had a very, very interesting comment. He said, as the world becomes more populous, as it becomes more interconnected, the very finite size of the Earth will be a force for instability. Because it used to be that wars were lost in the far reaches of sub-Saharan Africa, of the Far East, of other places. But now we're all in this together. And there's more and more of us, we're more and more connected, and the Earth doesn't get any bigger. It stays the same size. And he said this is a very, easy trend to miss because it is so gradual. And I think keep that in mind as I continue my talk. The very finite or limited size of the Earth as the years and decades go on will be an increasing force for instability. What do I liken it to? Remember in Europe, between 1919 and 1933 in Germany, you had the Weimar Republic. Now, the Weimar Republic was a very complex mechanism, which was why it failed in the end. You had an upper house, a lower house. You had Bavaria and Prussia as almost independent states. You had a presidency, you had a chancellor, and it was too complex to manage. And so there was always a state of permanent crisis. Now, the Weimar Republic ended with doom. That's not where I'm going in this lecture. The Weimar Republic could have ended very differently. You had some very talented politicians in the Weimar Republic. Gustav Stresemann, De Bruning. The Weimar Republic did not have to end so bad had it not been for the World Great Depression. But the reason I bring up the Weimar Republic is it's kind of like our world today. If you think of the collapse of technology shortening distances so much. We don't have a world government, and we have very little actual world governance. But what we do have increasingly is a world system. It's a system where the crisis over Taiwan and the Far East, over Japan and China, the crisis in Russia and Ukraine, the crisis in Europe with its migrants, and I'll get to that in a bit, all interact with each other, and they're all connected with each other. The problem of the Mexican border in the United States, which leads to a radicalization in American politics, which can lead to a certain presidential result in the future or in the past. All of this is interconnected. It's like a global-sized Weimar Republic. But remember what I said, the Weimar Republic did not have to end badly at all. And so that's where we are. We're in a kind of global Weimar. And it's made more intense by the fact that, and this is my opinion, when you think about it deeply, all three great powers, the US, China, and Russia, are all in decline in some way and in different ways. Russia, we know, is in decline. Every day that the war in Ukraine goes on, Russia loses influence in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, in the Russian Far East, because it doesn't have the money and the attention span and the manpower to manage 11 time zones. The U.S., we know, is in some sort of institutional decline because, Washington is corrupt. It doesn't function well. It can't pay its bills. There's increasing polarization. The Democrats have become more left-wing. The Republicans have become more right-wing. It's harder and harder to forge a compromise in Washington. And when it does, and you look behind the curtains, like with this current debt crisis, you find that there's not much there at all. Kind of. And then there's China. Now, we all think of China as something insurmountable on a hill, but it's not. China's problems are just as deep, arguably deeper than the US or Russia, and it's masked by the fact that China is an authoritarian system. So many of its problems remain hidden. But China is a system now where increasingly hardcore Marxist-Leninists are making purely economic and financial decisions in Chinese markets. That cannot end well. That kind of situation. China's population is leveling off and will decline. Money is leaving China by the tens of billions of dollars of outflows of stocks and bonds and other investments. It's harder, and China is more and more urbanized. China is harder and harder to govern than it is ever before. But decline, now you say, this is terrible, all three powers, great powers, are in decline. Well, here's the other side of the coin. Decline itself is overrated. The British Royal Navy started to decline in the 1890s. That did not stop Great Britain from winning World War II half a century later. Decline is gradual. You don't always see it. And the different great powers are declining at different rates in different ways, so that one may have an advantage over another at a different time. The only sure thing we can say about decline is that it leads to a more complex, chaotic world. A world of middle-level powers like Iran and Turkey and Brazil and others, and systems with complex power arrangements are inherently more unstable than a bipolar system, or what was for a few years after the Berlin Wall fell, a unipolar-led American system. And, well, we say, what about great people? It's, you're being too fatalistic, too geopolitical. What about individuals? Well, individuals can do a lot, but they can also do harm. Let's look at the three powers. The United States got into a war in Iraq, basically because of I'll say this, though he's a lovely man when you meet him in person, a very weak president, George W. Bush, who just was not a good president. Russia invaded Ukraine thinking it would be over in a few days. Look at what happened. And China has this death wish with conquering Taiwan, which may not end well at all for China. So just as human beings can save the day, human agency can also work in a very negative way as well. Individuals matter in history, but not always for the best. So it's we're in a very tense situation. Now, we had the United States had a great historian at the turn of the 20th century by the name of Henry Adams. Now, Henry Adams was the great-grandson of America's second president, John Adams. And he was the grandson of America's sixth president, John Quincy Adams. And Henry Adams was a genius. He was not a politician like his great-grandfather and his grandfather, but he was an historically minded genius and writer. And one of the things he wrote in 1907 in his autobiography, 1907, was that, Russia was, is, and always will be the problem of Europe. That the big problem of Europe will always be Russia, and how to integrate Russia into the European family of nations. Because Russia is just too big, too chaotic, too autocratic, too non-Western to really fit nicely inside Europe. Now, he wrote this in 1907. He died a few years later. Then we had World War I. And World War I, the first great battle of World War I was where Tannenberg, today in Poland, between who? The German army and the Russian army. And it was because Russia got out of World War I that the Tsar fell, and that led, to the communist Bolshevik regime, which would go on to murder tens of millions of people. And then World War II. Where was the bloodiest front of World War II? It was in the east, between Germany and Russia, Stalingrad and Kursk, and all of those great battles. And then you had the Cold War for 50 years, where Russia dominated the eastern half of Europe. But we thought that we were beyond Russia at the end of the Cold War because Russia was weak, it turned in on itself, it became very chaotic. The only reason we were able to intervene in the Balkans successfully was because of the weakness of Russia in the 1990s. Because after all, the Balkans were historically a zone of Russian influence. And had Russia been as strong in the 1990s as it later became and was, the Western intervention in the Balkans would either have never have happened or would have happened in a very different way, a very less satisfying way. Well, now, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, in Henry Adams's terms, we have re-entered the groove of history. We're really deep in the groove of history, where we're really facing what Henry Adams warned against. And, war is politics by other means. And if we don't know how this spring-summer offensive is going to go, but if Crimea were to be seriously threatened, Putin could lose power. Because Crimea is not eastern Ukraine. Crimea has a really historic, romantic overtones in the Russian psyche. Crimea reminds Russians of Catherine the Great. It's an ethnic Russian area. It's strategic. If Putin were either to lose or be really threatened in Crimea, the effect of war in Ukraine could affect politics in Moscow. And we don't know how that will end up because Russia is not like China. China is actually a very deeply well-institutionalized state. It's the oldest bureaucracy in history. It was a fully grown bureaucracy when Rome was just a small republic already. And if Xi Jinping were to get sick or to be incapacitated, China has a mechanism, a bureaucratic mechanism to select a new leader. Russia has none of that. It's a black box. What would happen if Putin were really weakened? I think it was interesting that Putin was indicted as a war criminal in The Hague because that decision to indict him has two elements in it. One is that there will soon be a post-Putin Russia. And number two, that post-Putin Russia will be benign. It will be friendly in some way or another. Those are big things to assume. I'm not sure I agree with them. It could make things very, very complex. The longer the war goes on in the Ukraine, if it goes on into the fall and into the winter, Russia could be facing imperial collapse. Because as I said a while back, that Russia lacks the ability, the finances, the ability, the manpower, the military manpower to control the Caucasus and Central Asia and the Russian Far East, where the Chinese are getting stronger and stronger by the day in those regions. And, everyone hates empire. They say empires leave chaos in their wake. It's also true that empires arise, they come into existence because of chaos, as a way to alleviate chaos. You don't like empire? See what happens when it collapses. It can be very, very messy indeed. And, and to think about a Russian imperial collapse, there's something I should have said earlier. In this time in history, we have to use our imagination more than ever before. If any of you have read Tolstoy's War and Peace, there was a character in that novel called Count Rasputtin. And Count Rasputtin was a brilliant analyst. And he could actually analytically map out the fact that Napoleon could invade Moscow, and that Muscovites would desert the city and it would be set on fire. He worked that out analytically. But when it actually happened, he was more surprised than anyone. He was more devastated than anyone. Because though he could think about it analytically, emotionally, he could not imagine it, and therefore thought it could never happen. So in this time in history, when we don't know what the future of Putin will be, of Russia, and this is my belief, that in a few years we're going to see the end of the Islamic regime in Iran. And, we have to use our imaginations because, it's not enough to think analytically. We have to imagine a new regime in Iran. We have to imagine a chaotic Russia or something like that. These things will happen, or some variation of these things will happen. For the moment, talking about Europe, Europe's whole focus, in the newspapers at least, is in the East, in Ukraine. If Ukraine can survive, will it become a member of NATO? Will it become a member of the EU? How will that affect NATO? How will that affect the EU? It may make NATO so big and unwieldy and difficult to manage, and even more so the EU, that while it will be greeted as a triumph the moment it happens, it could lead to a decline of Europe over time. We don't know. But as I said, we're focused now on the East. But if you're in Italy, if you're in Spain, what are you focused on? You're focused on the fact that even as world population levels off, it's still growing in absolute terms dramatically in sub-Saharan Africa. And especially among young male youth, and it's young male youth in every society in the world who create political upheaval, so to speak. And it isn't just failed states in Africa. It's successful or semi-successful new middle-class, semi-democratic states where once people, when people become middle-class, they're very ungrateful. They don't say to their leaders, thank you for making us middle-class. They have demands. They want this, that, and the other. And they say, we don't like this place anymore. We can do better living in Europe. So Europe is liable to get more migrants from a new middle class Africa as it gets from a poor failed state Africa as well. And the only barrier between sub-Saharan Africa and Europe is a bunch of creaky, badly run autocracies in northern Africa, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Algeria, etc. So think of the Mediterranean not as a divider, but as a connector, in future years and decades. So Europe is not North America. It doesn't have two big oceans on its side. It doesn't look to the north and see a bunch of very peaceful Canadian middle-class citizens. The U.S.'s only border problem is in the south, in a small stretch of Mexico, Central America. And look how that has been radicalizing American politics. So think of Europe. Europe is right next to Russia. It's right next to sub-Saharan Africa. It's right next to the Middle East. The future of Europe in this increasingly tightening, more and more connected, anxious, globalized world, the future of Europe will be partly determined by the futures of Africa, the Middle East, and Russia. There was a great thinker in the 1920s, 30s, Henri Pirenne, and another one in Britain, Denny Hayes, who basically said that the Mediterranean is not Europe's southern border. Europe's southern border is North Africa, because Europe doesn't end until the Sahara Desert begins. That in Roman times, in late antiquity, the whole northern coast of Africa was Latin-speaking. They spoke Latin. It only became Arab-speaking because of the Arab invasion. And why did that happen? Because of wars between Persia and Byzantium weakened both of those empires so much that the Arabs rose and conquered North Africa. So this is an example of how Europe's future can be partly determined by events that happen elsewhere. Look at the Ottoman invasion into Central Europe, into Vienna. Look at the Slavic migrations in the 5th and 6th century AD that created what is today Poland, the Czech Republic, the states of the Western Balkans, etc. So to think about Europe, you have to think about everywhere that is continuous. to it. Now, let me say a few words about China. And, people ask me, is America going to desert Europe, to focus on China? They keep asking me that. And I say, look, here's how to look at it. Because of this smaller, anxious, more interconnected world, you can't separate the two. That what happens in Ukraine will have an effect on what happens in the Pacific. But nevertheless, policymakers have priorities. And if you're an American policymaker, your priority has to be the Pacific. It has to be the Far East, because that's where more of the trade is, where more of the economics are. It's where America has very strong military allies. Japan in the north, Australia in the south, Singapore, Vietnam. These are states where America doesn't have to encourage them to increase their defense budgets. They're doing it anyway on their own. Japan's going to double its defense budget. Australia's buying nuclear-powered submarines from the United States. When America looks at Europe, it has to keep prodding and pushing them to increase their defense budgets, whereas in the Pacific, the allies are the best allies you can ever want. They're doing everything without even being asked to do so. So America, if a push comes to shove, would focus on Asia. But I don't think it'll be that simple. I really think we'll be in an interconnected, organic world where China will become more and more not just a Pacific power, but a Eurasian power, using Russia as a gas station, getting cheap oil and gas from Russia because Russia has nowhere else, cannot sell it anymore to Europe, at least in the short term, looking forward, unless there's a change of regime in Russia in some ways. So, as I said, and Taiwan for America, it's more than defending democracy in Taiwan. If that's all it was, it wouldn't be the big issue that it is. It's about Taiwan's role in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea. A war in Taiwan would be a war over both the East and South China Seas. It would quickly expand to Japan and to Australia. And let me tell you, the world financial markets have handled well the Ukrainian war. They handled all the wars in the Middle East going back, 20, 25 years. If there was a high-end military hot conflict in the Pacific, it would be a traumatic event, to put it mildly, for financial markets. And therefore, America has to be focused on, number one, defending Taiwan, but also preventing any outbreak of a hot war with China, because that would affect standards of living of all of us. None of us would be able to escape. When I look at just a few things to close up, people say it's all about democracy versus autocracy. No, it isn't. That's the issue in Europe, because Europe is democratic except for Belarus and Ukraine and parts of the Caucasus. And because Europe has all the building blocks of democracy, when there is no democracy in a place, that place is a disaster. So when you talk about democracy is crucial to Europe, fine, but it's not crucial to the Middle East. You go throughout the Arabian Gulf, all the sheikdoms. You go to Saudi Arabia, and things are fine. There's more and more personal freedoms. Governments are governed very well in this new age of technology. There's basically a social contract between ruler and ruled. The people being ruled say, you give us good government, you give us peaceful, fluent changes of power when a leader dies, you don't oppress us too much, and for our part, we won't question who runs the show, essentially. That's the social contract in the whole Arabian Peninsula, essentially. And as for democracy, the Arab Spring has failed in Tunisia, in Libya, in Lebanon, in Syria. Remember, Yemen, the civil war in Yemen began as the Arab Spring. And then it completely failed, led to chaos, and led to civil war. So again, I'm back to where I started at the beginning. Don't think that because Europe is going in a very demonstrable democratic direction that holds true for the rest of the world. Other parts of the world are going in completely different directions. And let me just close with a final remark about the United States. The United States was a great, well-functioning mass democracy in the print and typewriter age, which extended from the early 19th century up until the late 20th century. It is unclear to me that America can continue as such a stable, well-functioning, a dynamic mass democracy in an age of digital video social media, which has the effect of social media benefits the extremes, whereas the print and typewriter age benefited those in the middle, in the center. So America is facing a difficult transition now because the age of technology is different than the age in which America won World War II, helped win World War I, and won the Cold War and all of that. We're in a different technological age, and that will affect American politics. So I hope I've been constructively pessimistic. Why are Americans so optimistic? I've always been optimists. It's because their nation was founded by pessimists. The founding fathers, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, they were all sourpuss aristocrats, and all they did was think and write about everything that could go wrong. And that's what the Federalist Papers are all about when you read them. They say this could go wrong and this could go wrong and we shouldn't do this and we shouldn't do that. And they were so good at constructive, tragic thinking that they created a nation of optimists, So I'll end that here. Thank you very much. Thank you. You just moderate the questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Robert Kaplan, for that extraordinarily fascinating and far-reaching lecture. I'm sure that many of you here have questions, so fortunately we have some time for questions. I can see hands up already. So I will pass down the microphone to you. I just saw one here. And you have one. Okay. Yes, if you could stand up and introduce yourself, I think it would be helpful.
Hi there, my name is Oleg Turchin. If you can hear it, I have some Russian roots. So maybe a quick question, Mr. Kaplan. First of all, thank you for your excellent information. And secondly, my personal opinion about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. If you look at the impact of social media, I personally think the only thing Russia has actually succeeded in is the disinformation spread it through social media, and people still today believe it. How do you think it's possible to counter it?
To what?
To counter the social media, the disinformation spread by regimes like Russia.
Yeah, well, that gets back to globalization 2.0, which is that in technology is not all good. It could be used for negative purposes. I think one of the dynamics of the next few years and decades will be how authoritarian regimes can use technology to basically influence people's minds. If they can control technology, it's a battle. It's a battle between for instance, one area where technology, where social media, I'll admit, has played a totally positive role was in the recent uprisings in Iran. If you look at what happened in Iran, and you can see a future at the end of the regime in Iran, you could see how digital media could play a big role. And even in the Green Revolution in 2009 in Iran, remember, the Iranian Green Revolution against the regime happened 2 years before the Arab Spring. It was a forerunner to the Arab Spring, essentially. So that it's very hard. It's very hard, to do this. But we shouldn't be naive about digital media. It can free people, I'll admit that, but it can also be a real tool of authoritarian regimes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Kaplan, you compared the state of the planet to the Weimar Republic, and you added that it didn't have to end in doom. And later in your presentation, you said we needed to show some creativity in how to tackle all of that. I have two questions. When you said we, who do you mean at the time that we are discovering that the West, that the transatlantic alliance may not be as popular in the rest of the world as some of us thought we would be? And my second question is, could you help us in this creative process of thinking about how to structure this new world? Of course, we'll continue the reflection after you've gone, but give us a hint at your own thinking on that point.
I think that, generally, I think that the Biden administration has handled Ukraine very well, so far at least. I think it's the best demonstration of creative American power since the first Gulf War of 1991 with the elder Bush administration. I think, though, that they've made one big mistake, which gets to your question, which is they should not frame it as a war between democracy and autocracy, because that leaves a lot of autocracies that are actually very well functioning and provide civil liberties for their citizens out of the picture. And I'm thinking about some of the states of Southeast Asia. I'm thinking of some African countries. I'm thinking of almost the entire Arabian Peninsula. We should have framed it in the same way that James Baker, former Secretary of State, framed the coalition against Iraq in the first Gulf War, which is, it was, for Iraq to invade and conquer Kuwait was a violation of world order, of global norms. And had the Biden administration done that and just said, this has nothing to do with democracy, we just can all unite in the fact that a big country should not be able to, just launch for no reason a World War II level struggle on a smaller place. I think if he had done that, you would have had more support in the global South. You would have had more support in Southeast Asia, among the Saudis, the Arabian Peninsula, and many African countries as well. But they framed it in ideological terms, is that if you're not a member of the Democratic Club, you're not an ally of us. And I think one of the reasons why the world at large, the global South, we'll call it, you know what I mean, has not signed on to this conflict the way the West hoped, is because the administration has committed one mistake in its overall policy. It's framed it as democracy versus autocracy, and that leaves out a lot of allies.
Good evening. My name is Daria Safai. I am a member of the Belgian Parliament, but I am born and grown up in Iran. So I was there until when I was 25 years old. And I know how the people struggle there to break freedom and to be free. But when they are on the streets, even after 44 years, they demand democracy, freedom, all our values. I have the impression, even in our politic world, that European and Western countries, they are not obvious about what they want in the future of Iran. And I'm afraid, I know that the change will come by the people, of course. We cannot do anything from Europe or anywhere. But I'm afraid if we don't support them maximally, it will just kill the people, and it doesn't give any result which is a better result for the future of the whole world. I wanted to know, what do you think that the world can do, and do you think that they do enough? Even they are not ready to put IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, on the list of the terrorists in Europe. I mean, in America, they have done it in 2019. And I'm not sure if the people can do it alone if we don't support them. Just, I wanted to know your opinion.
It's
Thanks.
it's sort of the ultimate question in a way, because the regime in Iran is not like the Shah. The Shah was sick. He was dying of cancer. He was very weak. And as one Egyptian told me, an Egyptian friend was telling me about General al-Sisi, the ruler of Egypt. And I was criticizing al-Sisi, and he said, no. If Iran had had a General al-Sisi in 1979, there never would have been an Islamic revolution in the first place. So much can turn on the slightest thing, so to speak. I think that we will see at some foreseeable point the death of the current supreme leader. There'll be some maybe a lot of politics behind the scenes, maybe occurring right now, as to who replaces him. Because if they don't provide a unified front, the revolutionary authorities, they could be in a lot of trouble. They could be. So the thing is to settle it before he dies, so to speak. It will. I'm on the one hand, I'm very pessimistic that there will be more death, there will be more loss of life, that there's no way around it. On the other hand, I'm optimistic in the sense that I don't think Iran will be like the Arab Spring. It's not going to be a failure like Egypt or Sudan or Syria. Iran is like an age-old civilization. It's not Arab. It's different. And therefore, if any country in the greater Middle East has the potential to shift from authoritarianism to what we'll call a normal country, it doesn't have to be fully democratic, to some sort of civil kind of rule, it would be Iran. So, it's amazing. You have like 85 million Iranians. They're not in the global economy. Imagine if you had 85 million Iranians suddenly inside the global economy. Every big Western corporation would be there tomorrow investing, building. Iran is the big black hole in the global world at the moment. But I have to see, I don't see how it ends without more bloodshed. Unless, the way these things happen without bloodshed is when there's basically an amnesty. Whether there's a negotiation for the people who are some of the worst criminals, said, just, we won't touch you. You know what I mean? Just don't make trouble for us. Or there's some sort of an agreement. Because unless there is some sort of an agreement like that, I don't see how it happens peacefully.
Oh, hello, Mr. Thanks so much, Mr. Kaplan, for coming here. I have a question. I read the book, maybe you read it too, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism by Joel Kotkin.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. He presents a very pessimistic future with growing inequality, a smaller and richer elite, industrial tycoons, supranational organizations, media, and disintegrating middle class, and then a growing underclass. What do you think of his vision?
I think a lot of problems are self-correcting. For instance, one of the trends going on now is young people, highly educated people, are leaving the big cities. And they're going to middle-sized cities in the center of the United States because big cities don't function very well. So the whole idea of an elite, of an urban elite, in conflict with what we'll call it Trump's America, is itself dissipating. So some of these problems can be, can be solved gradually on their own. But Joel Kotkin is a great urban thinker, a great thinker of the future of urbanism. And he should, his worries are very profound and serious.
There's another question here in the front.
Hello. Does it work? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the lecture. My name is Jasper. I'm a student at the VUB, and I have a question that I think will be simple but hopefully broadly applicable. And that's, how do you think about the issue of this classical realist idea of spheres of influence in geopolitics? Spheres of because of course, sorry. Yeah, just spheres of influence. Because on the one hand, I think what I appreciate about your thinking is the credence you give to the historical forces and geography in history, but also in this lecture you mentioned the power that individuals can have for better or for ill. So would you say that, for example, Russia having a sphere of influence near Eastern Europe or China in its region, is that a factor of geography and history is kind of predetermined, or is there room for individual action and ideological change in those regions?
I think spheres of influence are too simplistic because, China does not have Asia as its sphere of influence because it's U.S. allies from Japan south to Australia, including Taiwan and, in a de facto sense, Singapore, in another de facto sense, Vietnam. China is very active in Latin America, even though it's the backyard of the United States. Europe will be the fight zone between U.S. and Chinese influence because Europe cannot do without China to sustain its standard of living and growing prosperity. It's not like the Cold War. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union had no economy. So obviously the whole Atlantic Alliance traded with each other. But now, with China having the world's second largest economy, we're asking our European allies to limit trade with China in important sectors. And I don't know how that's going to work out. So Europe will be the biggest zone of contention between the United States and China going forward, even as China gains more and more influence moving towards Europe in Russia, because Russia, however this war ends, is going to be weak. It's going to be much weaker than it is now.
A question here. Question down here at the back, Maeve McMahon. Thank you so much for your lecture. It was fascinating. Just picking up really on what you said there and how you described earlier Washington. You said it was a little bit too corrupt, with the Democrats getting too left, the Republicans too right. Or how do you look at or view Brussels? Obviously, I'm not speaking about here, the city centre of Brussels. I mean the EU and the EU institutions.
Wait, can you repeat that question at the end, please?
Sure. Just because you mentioned Washington and you described how you feel about it. When you think about Brussels, how do you view Brussels? And I don't mean here where we are now in the city centre. I mean the EU. Who's in charge? Who would you call if you want to speak to Europe, so to say? And where do you see Europe in 10, 20 years?
Yeah.
Is it fit for the tasks that you described in that lecture?
The limiting factor of the EU is that it's a bureaucratic organization without being an emotional nation-state organization. There was this great late academic of national identity named Benedict Anderson at Cornell, and he said, there are no tombs of the unknown soldier for environmentalists, or for liberals or conservatives. There are only, war tombs for people who fight for a specific nation and language, kind of. And I think that, Europe has not developed a kind of chill up your spine patriotism that still may exist in individual countries. Within Europe. That's been the limiting factor of Europe, of the EU, so to speak. NATO is different. NATO functions very well, but remember, NATO has it easier. NATO is just a military alliance. It doesn't determine the quality of fat in the yogurt you eat every morning. It doesn't put its fingers into your economy and, your tax system and all of that like the EU does. So NATO doesn't need that. NATO is a military alliance of sovereign states. What the EU has done is take away a lot of that sovereignty and put it in a bureaucratic, mechanism where people kind of agree it's a good thing and we're glad it's here, but we don't really feel any real blood loyalty towards it in any sense. And I think that's the limiting factor of the EU. And the EU also has another aspect. There was a great historian of Europe who died a number of years ago, Tony Judt. He was Belgian, I think, or half Belgian. And he taught at NYU, at New York University. And he said the mentality of Europe, meaning the EU used to be the common market, the European Union, all of that. The mentality of Europe was built on expansion, because it was basically a utopian idea that always had to expand. And this worked up until, say, 20 years ago, when it expanded into parts of the Balkans. It expanded throughout Central Europe. And then came the financial crisis of 2008 to 2010, 11, and it stopped expanding, and it doesn't want to expand anymore. And bringing in Ukraine, a badly institutionalized economy of 44 million people, will be a tremendous challenge. Remember, Greece, which got into the EU in 1981, I believe, is only now a success. And look at the pain and the hardship that, if you remember the crisis from 12 years ago, what Greece had to go through. And Greece is only 10 million people. So imagine Ukraine with 44 million people. So the EU has to somehow find a way to convert its bureaucratic expansion into a mission, into an emotional mission that people can identify with.
So we have two more questions on this side, and then I think we'll take one final question after those two. So there was one here. Yes? And then you'll be after.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Kurt de Boeuf. I was a bit surprised when you said that actually China is in decline. I would rather say that it is the massive growth is slowing down. But however, you got me interested in your mark. Can you elaborate a bit why you think that China is really in decline?
Yes, I can. Deng Xiaoping, in my opinion, was the greatest man of the 20th century. He was greater than Roosevelt, greater than Churchill. Why? Why do I make such a bold statement? Because Deng Xiaoping dramatically improved the economic and social lives of more people in a quicker period of time than ever before in recorded economic history. He brought China from a world of destitute poverty and semi-chaos when Mao died at the end of the Cultural Revolution, and basically invented the China we see today, this economic dynamo, with 100 million people in the middle class, etc. I think, and Deng Xiaoping's philosophy was followed by Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, and it followed up until about a decade ago when Xi Jinping took power. And what Xi Jinping has done is reverse the roles. He's gone back towards Marxist-Leninism and away from capitalism. And as I said before, when you have ideologues making purely economic decision-making, many more mistakes will happen than otherwise, and it cannot be a good thing. So I think Xi's rule, it's very aggressive, it's very threatening. It makes us stand up and pay attention, but I think it's the beginning of China's decline.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Is the mic on? Yeah. Thanks a lot for the presentation, Mr. Kaplan. I'm Peter Gronier with the Von Karman Institute, and I just wanted to continue a little bit on the previous question. You mentioned a list of autocratic countries which appear to be working well. You did not include China in that list. Did I understand that correctly?
No, China's included in that list, but it's not. It's working less and less well.
Okay. And then you also said that the country has a dead wish to invade Taiwan, which might not end well for the country. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yes. First of all, one thing we know about wars is that all plans tend to end after the first contact. World War I was imagined as a short, sharp war, lasting a few weeks at the most. A war over Taiwan would involve high-end weaponry, hypersonic missiles, precision-guided missiles, cyber attacks, across thousands of miles, deep missile strikes into the interior of China. It would be a contest of who could knock out the other side's satellites quicker than the other. It would be hard to contain it as a short, sharp war. And the only way that China could basically undermine Taiwan while the American public would be opposed to fighting for Taiwan would be if it was by stealth. By stealth. Cyber disinformation campaigns focused on the Taiwanese territory and that sort of stuff. But if it was ever actually China literally invading militarily Taiwan, I think it would be very hard for America to stay out of the picture. That an American administration would have support for it. Public support for it, and it would be greater and less ambiguous, perhaps, than its support for Ukraine at the moment.
We have one more question here at the back.
Hold up, is this thing on? Does this work or? Okay, so I have one simple question. So I've lived in the UK for about, I'd say, 16 years. And I was there to see the whole Brexit deal, and basically what happened there, where there was like this large campaign where basically all these big businesses told people to vote Leave, and in the end, like the Leave campaign, the campaign basically was like the final results were 52 to Leave and 48 to Remain. My question is, how do you think the entire idea of Britain leaving the EU, its individualization, is locking down with what we can recently see with its policy that takes away modern slavery protection laws for legal immigrants, and basically how is just the locking down, Americanization, and just the entirety of Brexit just impacted the way that the world perceives the UK and how the rest of the EU perceives it?
Yeah, I think that Britain leaving the UK was such a difficult bureaucratic process, so complex that it brought down one, arguably two prime ministers, essentially, that it was sort of an inoculation, that no other major country will want to leave the EU because they won't want to go through what Britain has gone through. There was this idea that Britain would become like Singapore. It would become a standalone global hyperpower on a relatively modest-sized island. But British are not the overseas Chinese, and Singapore has no territory. It's just a city-state. Singapore is like Greater London and nothing more, So things are simple in Singapore in that sense. So I think it's going to be a very difficult path for Britain, and I think other European states will look upon Britain's experience with leaving the EU and say, no, that's not for us. We're not going to go down that road. You know, there's still, the big push is not to leave the EU, it's to get into it. You know, whether it's Serbia, whether it's Albania, whatever, they all want to get into the EU.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I would like to just thank everybody in the audience for your wonderful questions, and perhaps we could raise our hands for another applause for Robert D. Kaplan for his...
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, fortunately, this evening we have a drinks reception to invite you all to continue the discussion. But before that, I'd like to welcome Professor Jonathan Holslag to speak to us and to give us some closing remarks. Professor Jonathan Holslag is also an esteemed writer on geopolitics, and he's the Professor of Political Science at VUB. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. What a great lecture. Thank you for that, Robert. Good evening, everyone. Let me first of all start thanking some of the people who made this evening possible. In the first place, thank you, Mayor Kloos, for your hospitality. It's always, I think, a very special experience to have these rich exchanges in as opulent a venue as here. I would also like to thank all the colleagues of my university who were supporting in many different capacities. The audience, of course, a lot of friends I see here. And then obviously also, again, our speaker, Robert, who I think shared a lot of important insights with us, but also on a personal note, who was one of my first companions when I started making foray into this very, very interesting domain called world politics. In fact, my first travel to Africa, I had your book, A Journey to the Ends of the Earth, with me. Yesterday, Robert, we visited some of the war cemeteries near to Passchendaele. That was a very, very gripping moment I found. Not only did I experience it almost as a surreal moment, in spite of this confrontation with our own history of hardship and bloodshed, we visited this place in a very beautiful day in May, and we had a nice breeze, and there were flowers, and you had the scent of the flowers drifting through these white tombstones. But our thoughts were also both together drifting to another place, Ukraine. Because at that moment that we were sort of commemorating our past, history was tragically in the making in another part of Europe. And I think both at the same time, we asked ourselves, what does the tragic mind then mean with regard to all of this? As you write in your recent book, it's a sort of acceptance of the world as it functions, also the fact that information is often incomplete, and that most of all, learning does not come easily. And in that regard, you refer to Sophocles and Oedipus, who only comes to understand the nature of his problems after a very, very long, turbulent while. Only after coming to grips with his lack of knowledge, he reaches wisdom in a way. And then I ask myself, can we learn? Will it ever happen? In your book, you offer it as a word of consolation that with wisdom, perhaps we might also better weather these different tragedies and crises. But can we learn? We live in a high age of information, but often with very limited knowledge, I would say, and perhaps even with less wisdom. And how then to overcome this tragedy that wisdom is only reached very, very rarely, I would say, amongst us and on the global scene more broadly. I think when we then go back to some of the personalities you refer to, the founding fathers and the Federalists, they, I think, give us some important clues. It's learning of history that I think is very, very important. learning from tragedies from the past, but also moderation. When I read the Federalists, it's not only an attempt at moderating the political passions to checks and balances, but it's also about cultivating a civic spirit that comes with moderation. And I find that theme in a couple of other Greeks, besides Sophocles, which of course I admire a lot. I think one comes to mind, that comes to mind is Themistocles. Themistocles, one of the great statesmen of Athens, who again and again imposed on the citizens of its juvenile city-state the necessity for, first of all, empathy towards each other, like he called that patriotism in a way, humility also, moderation in spirit, and then a sense of sacrifice for the common good. The sacrifice of the Laurian mines, the silver that was found there for building a fleet, but also fortifying the city, I think in that regard is very important. Second Greek that I think shares some interesting and important experience with us is Pericles. And he is, in Greek history and certainly the history of Athens, a bit more controversial already than Themistocles. But I think in his funeral oration, he, I think, gave us a very, very powerful line. He insisted that we can only be citizens and we can only function properly in interaction with each other if we throw into the weight of our judgment the full, if we throw into the scales of the judgment the full weight of us being parents. And I think that is a very, very important advice that he gives to us, because immediately it brings an intergenerational solidarity that I think might be a break on a lot of the folly and a lot of the bad decisions that we often make in international politics. Perhaps we could also complement it with a bit of Aristophanes to end on a light note. The important writer of different comedies, famously known, I think, for his saying that under every stone we find a politician, but also for the fact that he praised wine. And that leads me to the very end of this formal part. There is wine at the end of this reception room, and we all kindly invite you to this closure of the evening. And I would like to ask you to join us for a very final round of applause for our host, the mayor, and for everyone present here. Thank you.